It is mid-July. The sky is completely clear. A distribution transformer blows 2 streets over, and the municipal grid goes dark. You walk outside and look at your roof. You have $30,000 of monocrystalline silicon panels sitting in direct sunlight. They are actively absorbing raw photovoltaic radiation. You should be the only homeowner in the zip code with a functioning refrigerator and running air conditioning. Instead, your house is silent. Nothing works. You bought a promise. The contractor sat at your kitchen table and sold you the concept of energy independence. You signed a 20-year financing agreement under the assumption that generating your own electricity meant you owned it. You do not own it. You simply lease the privilege of generation. The moment the public grid fails, your rooftop array is physically paralyzed by a piece of code. It is called the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, Standard 1547, IEEE 1547. This is a mandatory compliance protocol, hard-coded into the firmware of every commercial grid-tied inverter sold in North America. When the utility company experiences a drop in line voltage, this standard dictates that your system must automatically sever its connection. The public justification is safety. Utility linemen repairing downed cables cannot have rogue voltage backfeeding into dead wires from residential solar panels. The logic appears structural. It protects human life. That is the cover story. The mechanical reality is entirely different. Standard 1547 does not simply sever your house from the street. It completely disables your inverter. Your rooftop panels continue to convert photons into direct current electricity. The kinetic potential is actively happening above your head. The voltage exists. But the inverter refuses to translate that direct current into the alternating current your appliances require. The hardware simply locks you out of your own physical property. You are locked out. To comprehend the scale of this structural surrender, you must understand the hardware you paid for. An inverter is simply a translator. It takes the raw, steady flow of electrons from the sun and chops it into the oscillating wave required by modern circuitry. Without that translation, solar power is useless to a home. By mandating that the inverter shuts down entirely during a blackout, the utility sector ensures you can never operate as an autonomous system. You did not buy an independent power plant. You financed a decentralized collection node for the municipal grid. The equipment sits on your property. You carry the loan. You assume the physical liability of rooftop deterioration. You pay the insurance premiums. But the moment the utility company cannot extract their yield from your thermodynamic flow, they flip a digital switch and shut down your machinery. The corporation dictates the terms of your survival. This is not an engineering flaw. It is a legally enforced baseline architecture. Millions of homeowners currently believe they are insulated against structural infrastructure failure. They possess the raw material. They possess the physical conversion mechanics. But they lack the hardware sovereignty to use it. They are tethered to the very monopoly they paid to escape. The trap is set. Imagine constructing an industrial air compressor inside your garage. You weld the heavy steel tank. You wire the copper motor. You lubricate the cast iron pistons. You finance every physical component using your own capital. You flip the switch. The motor hums. The pistons drive ambient air into the cylinder, compressing it, building immense kinetic potential. You have trapped raw atmospheric pressure. You possess the mechanical force required to run your tools. But there is a structural compromise. When you install the pressure regulator, you discover a proprietary, factory-sealed mechanism. It is a one-way pneumatic check valve. It is mathematically designed so that it cannot release air into your own garage. Instead, it is hard-piped directly into a municipal dirigible floating above your neighborhood. Your compressor runs flawlessly. The pistons pump. The steel tank holds the pressure. But that pressure is immediately siphoned off. It travels up the pipe to inflate the city's infrastructure. You are allowed to tap a tiny bypass hose to run your impact wrench, but only while the main valve is actively feeding the city. Now, observe what happens when the municipal dirigible detaches. The connection is severed. What happens to your compressor? It does not divert the air back to you. The one-way pneumatic valve senses the loss of external vacuum and instantly snaps shut. The pressure inside your steel tank spikes. To prevent catastrophic rupture, the proprietary hardware forces an automated shutdown. The motor cuts out. The pistons freeze. You have a steel tank full of compressed air sitting in your garage, and you cannot access a single cubic inch of it. Your machine is dead. This is the exact mechanical architecture of a modern grid-tied solar array. The monocrystalline silicon panels on your roof are the cast iron pistons. They compress solar radiation into raw direct current voltage. The grid-tied inverter, bolted to your basement wall, is the one-way pneumatic valve. And the municipal power grid is the dirigible. You did not purchase a standalone generator. You purchased a parasitic feeding tube. The structural asymmetry here is profound. You endure the physical labor of property ownership. You repair the roof penetrations beneath the aluminum racking. You wipe the particulate accumulation off the tempered glass. You pay the compound interest on the capital loan. You assume the absolute entirety of the mechanical liability. The utility company assumes zero liability. They own no hardware. They perform no maintenance. They simply connect their vacuum hose to your asset and harvest the thermodynamic pressure. Homeowners accept this parasitic relationship because of a psychological illusion. They look at the utility meter on the side of their house. During peak sunlight, the meter spins backward. The homeowner looks at this mechanical dial and feels a false sense of victory. They believe they are storing energy. They are not. You cannot store electricity on a spinning dial. A meter is simply a corporate ledger. It is an accounting document. The actual physical electrons, the raw, kinetic pressure you generated, are instantly siphoned away and consumed by the grid. The homeowner mistakes a financial credit for physical storage. The system is engineered to ensure you never achieve true mechanical isolation. If you could store and direct your own voltage, you would become autonomous. Autonomy is structurally unprofitable. Therefore, the residential hardware is deliberately crippled at the factory level. The parasitic siphon is permanent. They own your power. The industry calls it net metering. The phrase was deliberately focus grouped to sound equitable. It implies a balanced scale. A fair, one-to-one exchange of energy between a sovereign homeowner and a municipal provider. This is a linguistic deception. When you strip away the environmental marketing and examine the raw financial architecture, net metering is nothing more than a high-frequency algorithmic arbitrage scheme. Arbitrage is a precise economic term. It describes the act of acquiring an asset at a suppressed price and instantaneously reselling it in an adjacent market for a guaranteed margin, assuming zero physical risk. This is the exact revenue model of modern investor-owned utilities. They are not power providers. They are mathematical toll booths. Consider the physical reality of a Tuesday afternoon. It is 1 o'clock. The house is empty. The ambient temperature is mild, so the heavy HVAC compressor is completely idle. Yet, your rooftop solar array is operating at peak thermal capacity. The kinetic yield is immense. You are producing a massive surplus of raw voltage. Because your hardware is legally bound to the grid, the inverter pushes this surplus outward, back through the meter, and directly onto the municipal copper lines. The utility takes immediate possession of your surplus electricity. They credit your digital ledger. Here is the cold calculus. Governed by the rate structures set by your local public utility commission, the utility compensates you at the wholesale generation rate. Often this is 3 or 4 cents per kilowatt hour. But electricity moves at the speed of light. Those specific electrons do not travel to a distant, centralized battery bank. They travel 30 feet down the wire, straight into your next-door neighbor's active air conditioning unit. The utility instantly bills your neighbor for those exact electrons. They do not charge the wholesale rate. They charge the peak retail rate, 16, 20, sometimes 28 cents per kilowatt hour. The math is ruthless. The utility extracts the asset from your roof, moves it 30 feet, and realizes an exponential profit margin in a fraction of a millisecond. They burned no coal. They split no uranium. They subjected no turbines to thermal wear and tear. They simply executed an automated transaction using your physical hardware. You are the unpaid generation labor for a corporate dividend portfolio. The Public Utility Commission sanctions this spread. They are the regulatory bureaucracy tasked with setting the rates, and they legally codify this arbitrage into municipal law. They justify the massive markup as a transmission and distribution fee. But the electrons never touched the broader transmission grid. They merely hopped the local neighborhood transformer. The utility acts as a frictionless middleman, siphoning the economic value of your sunlight while you continue to pay off the $30,000 loan for the panels. It is a perfectly closed loop. You assume the debt, they extract the yield. To understand how this trap was engineered, you must examine the raw physics of alternating current. Power is not a static pool. It is a vibrating mechanical wave. When sunlight hits a silicon wafer, it dislodges electrons. This generates direct current. DC voltage is a continuous, flat line of unidirectional pressure. Your household appliances, refrigerator, compressors, well pumps, furnace blowers cannot utilize a flat line of pressure. They require alternating current. AC voltage reverses direction 60 times per second. This 60 Hz frequency is a strict mathematical sine wave. It acts as the structural heartbeat of the entire North American electrical grid. Your grid-tied inverter converts the flat DC pressure from the roof into the oscillating AC wave required by the house. But the inverter cannot simply push this wave outward blindly. It must synchronize. Picture two heavy steel gears attempting to interlock. One gear represents your inverter. The other represents the municipal utility grid. To transfer kinetic force without shearing the steel teeth, both gears must rotate at identical speeds. They must be in phase. If the inverter pushes while the grid pulls, the opposing sine waves collide. This phase mismatch triggers immediate thermal destruction. Copper lines vaporize. Breakers fuse. Phase matching is an unyielding law of physics. The power monopolies did not invent this constraint, but they weaponized it. The industry utilized this engineering requirement as a regulatory Trojan horse. They argued that because standard inverters must listen to the grid's heartbeat to align the electrical gears, the hardware must be legally restricted from generating its own internal rhythm. The engineering terminology for this is a grid-following inverter. The utility lobby systematically ensured that every subsidized, mainstream residential solar package utilized grid-following architecture. The machine requires an external master signal to function. It is a subordinate mechanism. The technology to build a grid-forming inverter, a machine possessing the internal oscillators to synthesize its own 60 Hz frequency and operate autonomously, has existed for decades. A grid-forming unit utilizes internal digital signal processors and heavy capacitor banks to artificially generate the reference wave. It acts as its own municipal turbine. The manufacturing cost difference between a grid-following subordinate unit and a grid-forming autonomous unit is negligible. It is a matter of silicon chips and software logic. The barrier is not economic. The barrier is bureaucratic compliance. The regulators drafted strict interconnection codes. They suppressed grid-forming capabilities in standard residential installations. They hard-coded dependency into the mass-market firmware. When the municipal gear stops turning during a blackout, your inverter is programmed to play dead. It does not take command of your home's circuits. It drops the connection. The conversion cycle halts. The direct current from your roof hits a silicon wall and dies. The science is real. The dependency is manufactured. They crippled the hardware. Return to the late 1970s. The Middle East oil embargoes fracture. The American illusion of infinite, cheap combustion. Gas lines stretch for miles. The federal government is panicked by the vulnerability of centralized infrastructure. In response, Congress drafts the Public Utility Regulatory Policies Act of 1978. It is known as PURPA. The stated legislative goal is total decentralization. The federal mandate legally forces established utility monopolies to purchase electricity from independent, small-scale producers. The law is publicly celebrated as the death of the centralized power cartel. It is framed as the birth of American energy independence. That is the historical cover story. Behind closed doors, corporate utility lawyers execute a brilliant, amoral legal pivot. They do not fight the federal mandate. They study the legislation, find the structural choke point, and co-opt the entire initiative. They concede the generation of power, but they ruthlessly lock down the transmission. The utility lawyers focus entirely on a legal concept called the point of common coupling. This is the physical wire where the private home meets the public street. If the monopoly is federally mandated to allow independent residential generators onto the grid, the monopoly will simply dictate the unyielding physical terms of the connection. They draft strict, proprietary interconnection agreements. They lobby for the exact hardware compliance protocols. They write the foundational codes that will eventually become the IEEE standards governing grid-tied inverters. They mandate the automated disconnect parameters. They do not outlaw solar panels. They outlaw autonomy. Look at the cold economic brilliance of this inversion. Before PURPA, utility monopolies had to float massive municipal bonds to finance billion-dollar coal and nuclear facilities. They carried the structural debt. They assumed the mechanical liability of turbine maintenance. Today, the corporate calculus is entirely shifted. The utility convinces the American homeowner to take out a $30,000 personal loan to build a micro-generator on their own roof. The utility does not pay for the silicon wafers. The utility does not finance the copper wiring. The utility does not ensure the roof penetrations against weather degradation. The homeowner absorbs 100% of the capital expenditure. The homeowner physically builds the power plant. The homeowner assumes the 20-year debt obligation. The utility simply manages the toll booth. Furthermore, PURPA established a pricing structure known as avoided cost. The utilities are forced to buy your power, but they dictate the mathematical formula. They calculate the absolute minimum fraction of a cent it would have cost them to generate that specific electron at a centralized plant, and they legally freeze your compensation at that floor. You absorb retail costs for equipment, but you are paid wholesale sub-pennies for your kinetic yield. They turned the American homeowner into an unpaid corporate asset. The legislation designed to sever the monopoly was mathematically inverted to fortify it. The utilities realized a fundamental truth of modern infrastructure. True power does not lie in generating the voltage. True power lies in controlling the copper wire that the voltage must travel through. As long as your hardware is legally and physically bound to their wire, you are bound to their financial ledger. You do not own a sovereign energy asset. You own a regulated appendage of the state grid. The dependency is codified. The architecture of dependency is clear. The hardware is locked. The algorithms are stacked against you. The municipal grip is tight, but you are not powerless. True sovereignty is not found in signing a corporate lease agreement for rooftop panels. It is found in taking physical, mechanical action to sever the telemetry chokehold. You must physically bypass the utility's control structure. You must build an island. In electrical engineering, islanding is the exact term utilities use to describe a localized circuit operating independently from the main grid. They view it as a safety violation. You must view it as the ultimate goal. The execution requires 3 specific mechanical upgrades to your home's infrastructure. First, you must bypass the grid-following inverter. You cannot rely on subordinate hardware. You must replace or retrofit your system with a true hybrid inverter, specifically one featuring a robust, internal, grid-forming capability. This hardware possesses the internal digital oscillators necessary to synthesize its own 60 Hz sine wave. When the municipal grid collapses, this machine does not play dead. It recognizes the failure, generates the internal heartbeat, and assumes total command of your home's electrical flow. It acts as the master clock. Second, you must sever the physical wire. A hybrid inverter is useless if the utility detects backfeeding voltage and forces a shutdown. You need a structural barrier. You need a manual transfer switch or an automated isolation contactor installed between your main breaker panel and the utility meter. This is a heavy, mechanical throw switch. It breaks the copper connection. When the grid goes down, you manually pull the lever. You physically isolate your house from the street. You create an impenetrable air gap. The moment that switch is thrown, the utility's IEEE 1547 compliance codes are rendered irrelevant because your system is no longer communicating with their grid. You are a sovereign electrical island. Finally, you must reclaim the raw kinetic potential of your roof. To capture the direct current pressure while the sun is shining, you must establish an independent thermal sink. This requires a robust, heavy-duty battery bank, preferably utilizing lithium iron phosphate chemistry for stability and cycle life, or deep cycle absorbed glass mat arrays. This bank acts as your own private dirigible. Instead of pushing your surplus voltage out to the utility for pennies, the hybrid inverter redirects the flow straight into your basement. You charge the cells during the afternoon peak. You discharge them overnight. You hoard your thermodynamic yield. Do not sign the net metering contracts. Do not accept the algorithmic arbitrage. Reject the utilities ledger. Stop buying permission. Start building infrastructure. Own the generation. Own the storage. Own the switch.